It's funny how, at certain points in history, some figures became just as famous as real kings, even though, in reality, they might not have existed at all. Thanks to legends passed down over centuries, medieval literature, and modern films, names like King Arthur, Robin Hood, and Mulan still live on as if they were actual historical figures. But were they? Today, we're diving into the stories of people who became historical icons, even though their existence is highly questionable. King Arthur. If there's one name that survived for centuries, blending fantasy, war, magic, and politics all in one, it's King Arthur. The thing is, storytellers love talking about him, but historians? Not so much. They're not even sure he ever existed. According to legend, Arthur was the great British king who united knights, fought off Germanic invaders, and ruled with honor, bravery, and justice. The famous Round Table, the sword Excalibur, the knights, the quest for the Holy Grail. It all sounds like the perfect script for a medieval epic, and maybe that's exactly what it is. A script, a work of fiction that somehow became tradition. Historically speaking, Arthur is said to have lived sometime between the late 5th and early 6th century, a chaotic time in Britain. The Roman Empire had pulled out, leaving behind a fractured land vulnerable to Anglo-Saxon invasions. It's in this mess that Arthur supposedly appeared, a war leader defending the Romanized Britons from incoming threats. Makes sense, right? But the details don't. The earliest mentions of Arthur pop up in Old Welsh poetry and a 9th century text called the Historia Brittonum. But in these early accounts, Arthur isn't a king. He's just a military hero, a guy who won battles. No magic, no round table, no castle, no Camelot. It wasn't until the 12th century that things got a serious upgrade. A Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth published The History of the Kings of Britain. In it, Geoffrey took bits of Celtic legends, oral traditions, and mythological tales, and built a brand new version of Arthur, a glorious king, chosen by fate, who ruled vast kingdoms and won epic battles with the help of magical advisors. This was the first time we see characters like Merlin, Uther Pendragon. From there, the myth just kept growing. French writers like Chrétien de Troyes added even more drama. The forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere, the holy mission for the Grail, and the legendary Knights of the Round Table. Each author added their own twist, expanding the Arthurian world like it was a medieval cinematic universe. But the bigger the legend got, the more the reality disappeared. The truth? There's zero archaeological evidence or contemporary records proving Arthur was real. No official documents, no ancient castles, no actual sword. Even places mentioned in the stories, like Camelot or Avalon, don't have confirmed locations. Some have linked Arthur to Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, but digs there haven't found anything tying the site to the legendary king. Even Geoffrey's book, which helped solidify the myth, isn't considered reliable history. Today we know it's basically a patchwork of old legends, made-up genealogies, and poetic embellishments. Geoffrey wasn't trying to be a historian. He wanted to build a national mythology. And honestly, he nailed it. Interestingly, even historians who want to believe Arthur was based on a real person admit that if he did exist, he was probably a local war leader named Artorius or something similar, and definitely not someone pulling swords from stones or hanging out with wizards. Still, despite all that, the myth won. Medieval literature took care of immortalizing Arthur. In the 15th century, Thomas Malory published Le Morte d'Arthur, the definitive collection of Arthurian tales. In the modern era, poets like Tennyson revived Arthur as a near-messianic figure, a symbol of lost honor and purity. Camelot became more than just a place. It became an ideal, a utopia. Then came film and TV, movies, shows, cartoons, video games. From the classic Excalibur to modern reimaginings like Cursed, Arthur keeps getting retold, reinterpreted, reinvented. Sometimes he's a noble hero, other times a brutal warrior. He's been portrayed as a saint, a flawed king, a man trying to save his people from ruin, and maybe that's why the legend refuses to die. William Tell. When we think of heroes, we usually picture someone with a verified place in history, a war veteran, a treaty signer, a revolutionary leader. But history doesn't always demand proof. Sometimes all it needs is a good story. And if there's one story that became a symbol of freedom, resistance, and national pride, without ever being confirmed as fact, it's the legend of William Tell. Our tale begins in Switzerland, more specifically in the canton of Uri, around the year 1307. Back then, Switzerland wasn't a country as we know it today. It was a scattered collection of small alpine communities, many of which were under the control of the powerful Austrian Habsburg dynasty. And it was this very rule that William Tell is said to have defied. According to legend, Tell was a simple man, a farmer, a hunter, and an archer with legendary aim. But more importantly, he was a man who refused to bow to tyranny, and that refusal is exactly what set everything in motion. As the story goes, an Austrian governor named Gessler raised a pole in the town square and placed his hat on top of it. Every passerby was required to bow before the hat, a symbol of submission to imperial rule. Tell walked by without so much as a nod. He refused to bow. As punishment, Gessler issued a brutal sentence. Tell would have to shoot an apple off his own son's head with a crossbow, miss, or even hesitate, and both of them would die. This is where the myth fully takes flight. Tell accepted the challenge. He loaded his crossbow, took aim, held his breath, and nailed the apple right down the middle. No harm to the boy. An inhuman feat, a miracle, a lucky shot, doesn't matter. What mattered was that the people saw it as an act of defiance, of fearless courage, of divine precision in the face of injustice. But the story doesn't end there. Despite succeeding, Tell was arrested by Gessler, who didn't trust his motives. During the arrest, the governor found a second arrow tucked into Tell's coat, and when he asked why he had it, Tell gave a now legendary answer: "If I had missed, the second arrow was for you." According to legend, Tell later escaped captivity during a storm, ambushed Gessler, and killed him, sparking a popular uprising that would eventually lead to the foundation of the Swiss Confederation. It's an epic tale, straight out of a hero movie: a cruel villain, a brave father, an impossible shot, revenge, and revolution. But here comes the part that kind of messes with the magic. Did William Tell actually exist? The most honest answer? Probably not. The first time his name appeared in writing was in the White Book of Sarnen, a chronicle written around 1470, more than 150 years after the events supposedly took place. Plenty of time for oral stories to evolve, grow, or be entirely made up. But the Sarnen book was just the beginning. In the 16th century, a historian named Aegidius Tschudi wrote the Chronicon Helveticum, where the story of Tell was laid out in full, complete with all the details we know today: the apple shot, the stormy escape, the killing of Gessler. And here's the kicker: the story of an archer shooting an apple off someone's head existed long before Tell. Similar versions appear in Norse sagas, especially in the legend of King Harald of Norway, so it's very possible the tale was borrowed, reworked, and made to fit the Swiss context. In fact, many scholars believe William Tell wasn't based on any real person at all. Instead, he may have been created as a kind of founding myth, a character who captured the spirit of independence, just as Switzerland was beginning to form its national identity. And honestly, that makes sense. In the 19th century, Switzerland needed a shared identity, something that could unite its many cantons, languages, and cultures. What better than a tragic, fearless, lone hero who stood up to an empire with nothing but a bow and an apple? Tell became a monument, an opera, thanks to Friedrich Schiller's 1804 play, which popularized the story across Europe. Then, in 1829, Rossini's opera, Guillaume Tell, gave the legend even more cultural weight, with its overture still instantly recognizable today. And just like that, a man who may have never existed became a national symbol. Today, William Tell appears on coins, stamps, school books, and national holidays. His statue towers over the square in Altdorf, right in the heart of Uri. He's taught as a model of bravery and integrity, and his story is woven into the very foundation of what it means to be Swiss. He represents what people wanted to see at the birth of their nation: dignity, courage, and resistance to oppression. And those values, unlike the man himself, definitely existed. They lived on in the farmers who fought for freedom, in the leaders who refused to pledge loyalty to the Habsburgs, and in the nameless ones who stood up to empires with nothing but invisible arrows. Merlin. Among all the legendary figures of Western history, few are as shrouded in mystery as Merlin. He's the archetypal wizard, the classic image of the robed sage, speaking in riddles and pulling the strings behind the fate of kings. And no matter how many centuries go by, the name Merlin still carries the weight of magic, prophecy, and the supernatural. But what if I told you that this man probably never existed? In most stories, Merlin is King Arthur's court magician and trusted advisor, a mysterious figure who manipulates the future, controls hidden forces, sees coming tragedies, and brokers alliances between worlds. He's credited with guiding Arthur to the throne, building magical monuments like Stonehenge, and even predicting the fall of Camelot. But unlike Arthur, who might have been inspired by a real Celtic war leader, Merlin is considered by historians to be purely fictional, a character born not from history, but from myth and the imagination of one man. That man was Geoffrey of Monmouth. Back in the 12th century, Geoffrey wrote two groundbreaking texts, the Prophecies of Merlin and the History of the Kings of Britain. In them, he introduced an entirely new character, Merlin Ambrosius, and placed him at the center of legendary and historical events. But Geoffrey didn't create Merlin out of thin air. He stitched him together from two figures found in Old Welsh folklore. The first was Myrddin Wyllt, a wild prophet and mad poet who fled into the woods after witnessing the horrors of war. He's often described as a wandering seer, living in a trance-like state in the northern mountains of Wales. The second was Ambrosius Aurelianus, a child prodigy mentioned in a 9th century chronicle called Historia Brittonum. This Ambrosius had no human father and showed supernatural gifts from a young age. Geoffrey merged them, the mad prophet and the magical child, and thus Merlin was born, half man, half mystery, a sorcerer who could see the future, bend kings to his will, and challenge the very laws of nature. In the legends, Merlin helps Uther Pendragon magically seduce Igraine, Arthur's mother. He foretells Arthur's rise to the throne, creates the Round Table, advises kings, and defeats their enemies. But like much of his life, Merlin's fate is also cloaked in mystery. In later versions of the legend, Merlin falls in love with the Lady of the Lake, often named Viviane, and ends up being tricked by her. She learns his secrets and traps him forever in a magical cave, or inside an enchanted tree, depending on the story. A poetic ending for a character who always lived on the edge between the natural and the supernatural. During the 12th and 13th centuries, French writers expanded Merlin's role even further. He became the star of poetic romances, entered the Arthurian Vulgate cycle, and took center stage as Arthur's mentor. At that point, Merlin wasn't just a wizard. He was the mastermind behind the throne, the voice of wisdom, the bridge between the world of men and the world of gods. But what about historical evidence? Simple answer: there is none. There are 0 records from the 5th or 6th centuries, when Merlin supposedly lived, that mention any magician, sorcerer, or supernatural advisor at a British court. No stones, no scrolls, no accounts. And perhaps most telling of all, we know exactly where Merlin came from. He didn't slowly emerge from oral tradition. He was written, invented, constructed, and that changes everything. Because while many legendary figures have murky, uncertain origins, Merlin has a creator, Geoffrey of Monmouth. Historians see Merlin as a deliberate literary invention, designed to add mystery and gravitas to Britain's mythical past. Geoffrey took ancient Celtic tradition, blended them with Christian elements, and created a character that felt like he stepped straight out of the mists of time. A sort of Christianized druid, a pagan prophet reimagined for medieval tastes. And yet, it worked. Merlin became a symbol of arcane wisdom. In the 19th century, he was romanticized as a mysterious old man in poetry. He inspired characters in Shakespeare, Tolkien, Disney, and of course, countless modern films and TV shows. Merlin embodies our fascination with the unknown. He stands for the mysterious, the sacred, the unexplainable, He's the wise mentor every hero needs, the one who guides, warns, prepares, but he's also solitary, tragic, and eventually forgotten. He represents the idea that behind every great king, there's someone working in the shadows, someone who understands the unseen forces, who reads the signs, who sees what no one else can. Hua Mulan. If you've heard the name Mulan, chances are you pictured a young Chinese woman, sword in hand, disguised as a man, bravely fighting to protect her father and her country. That image was cemented in our collective imagination thanks to Disney's animated film in 1998 and reinforced with the live-action remake in 2020. But Mulan's story didn't begin in Hollywood. It goes back much, much further. What's fascinating is that, despite being one of the most iconic figures in Chinese tradition, no one knows if Mulan ever actually existed, and we might never know. It all starts with an old poem called The Ballad of Mulan. It's short, straightforward, and without embellishment, but powerful enough to survive for centuries. Scholars believe it was composed around the 5th century, during the Northern Wei dynasty, a chaotic time in northern China, marked by repeated invasions from nomadic tribes like the Ruran. It was an era that demanded soldiers and sacrifices. The ballad tells us that when Mulan learns her elderly, ailing father has been drafted into the army, she makes a bold decision. She takes his place, disguised as a man. She doesn't ask for permission. She just goes. She fights for over a decade, side by side with other soldiers, and no one ever suspects a thing. Only after all the battles are won and she returns home does she reveal her true identity. In the original poem, no one realizes she's a woman the entire time. And here's the most striking part. When she finally reveals the truth, her comrades don't shun her. They don't punish her. They're amazed. They respect her. They celebrate her. That alone would be enough to create a legend. But the story didn't stop there. The Ballad of Mulan was lost for centuries. It was originally recorded in a 6th century anthology called Musical Records of Old and New, which later disappeared. The version that survived came from a 12th century collection called the Yuefu Shiji, which helped rescue the poem from total obscurity. Over time, Mulan's image evolved. During the Ming Dynasty in the 16th century, a playwright named Xu Wei wrote a stage play titled The Woman Mulan Goes to War in Her Father's Place. In this version, Mulan gained more emotional depth. She wasn't just a warrior. She became a character with inner conflicts, unshakable courage, and a profound sense of duty. By the 17th century, she appeared in a historical novel that wove her story into larger national events, tying her fate to the transition between the Sui and Tang dynasties. She wasn't just a heroic daughter anymore, she had become a key figure in Chinese history. But the more her legend grew, the more one question kept coming back. Did Mulan actually exist? And most historians have a pretty clear answer: probably not. There's no official record in Chinese dynastic histories that mentions the name Hua Mulan. No military documentation, no war journals, no stone inscription, which is strange considering that soldiers who distinguished themselves were often honored, especially one who supposedly fooled the entire army for over 10 years. And then there's the name itself. Mulan literally means magnolia in Chinese, so it may have been a symbolic nickname rather than a real identity. Another telling clue, the poem doesn't name any specific places, battles, generals, or dates. It's written in a broad, timeless way, as an archetype, a symbol, and maybe that's the point. Mulan's story doesn't have to be real to be true. She embodies essential values in Chinese culture, especially Confucian ideals like filial piety, honor, courage, and loyalty to one's family and emperor. In a deeply patriarchal society, Mulan stands out as an exception, a woman who acts like a man, fights like a man, and is still celebrated for being herself. For centuries, her tale was retold in operas, folk songs, historical novels. Each version added new layers. In some, she gets married. In others, she ends her life in tragedy. And in others still, she refuses glory and riches, returning home exactly as she left, anonymous. The Queen of Sheba. She's one of the most mysterious women in ancient history. Her name echoes through millennia, across cultures and religions. She appears in the Bible, the Quran, African folklore, European art, Islamic literature, and even in the royal chronicles of Ethiopia. And yet, no one really knows who the Queen of Sheba was, or better yet, whether she even existed at all. According to the oldest accounts, she lived around the 10th century BCE, ruling over a wealthy, exotic kingdom somewhere south of Israel. And that's where the first mystery begins. Where exactly was Sheba? Some scholars point to modern-day Yemen, linking it to the ancient Sabaean civilization, a commercial powerhouse known for its trade in spices, incense, and gold. Others argue Sheba was actually in Ethiopia, tied to the kingdom of Aksum and an African royal lineage. And then there's the theory that it was a fusion of both regions. But if we can't even agree on the geography, what do we actually know about her? Most of what we know comes from three main sources: the Hebrew Bible, the Islamic Quran, and the Kebra Nagast, an epic from Ethiopian tradition. Let's start with the Bible. In the Book of Kings, chapter 10 verses 1 through 13, and Chronicles, chapter 9 verses 1 through 12, she's portrayed as a queen intrigued by the fame and wisdom of King Solomon in Jerusalem. After hearing tales of his brilliance, she sets off on a journey with a massive caravan packed with gold, spices, and precious stones. Her mission? To test Solomon with hard questions, riddles, and puzzles, to see for herself if the hype was real. And according to the text, she was blown away. She praised Solomon, offered lavish gifts, and acknowledged the God of Israel as worthy of praise. That's it. No name, no romance, no love child. But that's where other traditions step in and rewrite the story. In the Quran, she returns in chapter 27, this time with a name, Bilqis. But the focus shifts. Solomon isn't just a wise king here. He's a prophet and servant of Allah. The encounter becomes a spiritual showdown. He sends her a letter, urging her to abandon sun worship and submit to the one true God. The Islamic version adds supernatural elements, like Solomon magically teleporting her throne to his palace, or the moment when Bilqis, stepping into what she thinks is water, realizes it's actually a floor made of crystal. By the end, she converts to Islam and acknowledges God's divine authority. But the Ethiopian tradition takes things to a whole other level. In the Kebra Nagast, a 14th century sacred Ethiopian text, she's called Makeda. And not only does she visit Solomon, she has a child with him, Menelik the Fur. When Menelik grows up, he returns to Jerusalem to meet his father, and according to legend, brings back the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. Yes, that Ark, the sacred relic that held the tablets of the law. The story claims it was taken from Israel and hidden in Aksum, establishing the Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia, a royal bloodline that claimed direct descent from Solomon and Makeda, and ruled Ethiopia all the way up to the 20th century. So, in under 1,000 years, a brief biblical cameo turned into the divine origin of an African empire. Pretty wild, right? But here's the big question. Where's the historical evidence for any of this? The short answer? There isn't any. We do know the kingdom of Sheba did exist in the southern Arabian Peninsula. Archaeological digs in Marib, Yemen, have uncovered palaces, temples, and inscriptions from the Sabaean civilization. But so far, not a single mention of a queen traveling to Jerusalem or linking up with Solomon. Same story in Ethiopia. Aksum is full of massive ruins, towering obelisks, royal tombs, but nothing that directly references Makeda or the Ark of the Covenant. And remember, the Bible doesn't give her a name or a precise homeland. All it says is that she came from the south, from Sheba. Everything else was added later by religious, cultural, and literary traditions. In other words, the Queen of Sheba is more a product of our collective imagination. Robin Hood. You've probably heard the phrase, "He stole from the rich and gave to the poor," and instantly, one name comes to mind: Robin Hood, one of the most famous outlaws in history, a symbol of grassroots justice, the people's hero who roamed Sherwood Forest, challenged the powerful sheriff of Nottingham, and stood up to the tyranny of Prince John. But what if I told you that this man, this icon of English folklore, probably never existed? The story we know today is a fascinating blend of legend, folklore, and literary invention. And like every great legend, it starts with what we think we know and ends in mystery. According to the most well-known version, Robin Hood lived sometime in the 12th or 13th century during the reign of King Richard the Lionheart, while Richard was away fighting in the Crusades. With the king gone, power fell into the hands of Prince John, a ruthless and unpopular ruler. That's the world in which Robin supposedly rebelled. Sometimes he's portrayed as a fallen nobleman, the Earl of Huntingdon, forced to live as a fugitive. In other versions, he's just a skilled yeoman, a kind of middle-class freeman, who knows the woods like the back of his hand, wields a deadly longbow, and leads a band of fellow outlaws. And those outlaws are key to the tale. Little John, the loyal second-in-command, Friar Tuck, the rowdy monk, Will Scarlet, the bold swordsman, and of course, Maid Marian, Robin's love interest, who in many versions is just as fierce as he is. The legend fills in the blanks with ambushes on dusty roads, duels on narrow bridges, bonfires in the woods, and a code of honor that always sides with the weak against the powerful. But here's the twist. None of that was part of the original story. The earliest references to the name Robin Hood are very different. Back in the 13th century, Robin Hood shows up in English legal records, not as a hero, but as a nickname for criminals and troublemakers. That's right, Robin Hood was basically the John Doe of medieval outlaws. It wasn't until the 15th century that written ballads began to shape the character we know today. In poems like A Little Jest of Robin Hood, Robin is already painted as a defender of the poor and an enemy of corrupt nobles. But even then, there's no mention of King Richard or Prince John, none of the historical context we now take for granted. Over the centuries, the legend evolved, picking up new layers as it went. During the Elizabethan era, Robin was reimagined as a nobleman wronged by society. Lady Marian joined the cast. The Sheriff of Nottingham became the main villain, and the missing king was finally named Richard the Lionheart, giving the story a more political, patriotic flair. But the real turning point came in 1819, with the novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. In this version, Robin was officially tied to the Saxon resistance against the Norman oppressors. He became a symbol of English identity and resistance, and that's when the modern version of Robin Hood truly took shape. So, with all these details, versions, and retellings, was there ever a real Robin Hood? The answer? Nobody really knows. Historians have combed through old records looking for a historical Robin Hood, and sure, they've found plenty of men named Robert Hood, Robin Hood, even a Hobahod, different guys from different places in different centuries. Many had criminal records, but none of them check all the boxes. None lived in Sherwood, none fought Prince John, none led a band of righteous outlaws. It's far more likely that Robin Hood is a mashup, a legendary composite of various real people, local myths, folk tales, and ideals of social justice. Homer. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: a blind man with a serious, almost mysterious look, wandering through ancient Greek villages and palaces, reciting immortal verses about heroes, gods, and great wars. Around him, crowds gathered in silence. Kids, completely captivated, elders, holding back tears. That man's name, Homer. Or, at least that's how the world likes to imagine him. Homer is arguably the most famous poet of all time. He's credited with two of the greatest works in Western literature: the Iliad, which tells the dramatic final days of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, the epic journey of the hero Odysseus trying to make it back home. These poems are ancient, foundational. They didn't just entertain, they helped shape an entire civilization's identity. Through them, the Greeks learned about glory, honor, courage, and also suffering, loss, and redemption. But here comes the uncomfortable twist. No one actually knows if Homer ever existed. First, let's look at the context. Homer supposedly lived around the 8th century BCE, during a period known as the Greek Dark Ages, a time without widespread writing, when stories were passed down orally, generation after generation. And that's exactly where the mystery begins. because no one from Homer's time, or even the centuries after, speaks of him with any certainty. 7 different cities claim to be his birthplace. Some said he was from Chios, others Smyrna. Some even pointed to Cilicia. Tradition paints him as a blind, wandering poet, traveling from town to town, reciting his tales. But that image might be entirely symbolic. As time went on, scholars started to notice something odd. The poems attributed to Homer contain language from different time periods, different dialects, patterns that scream oral tradition, repeated phrases, and formulaic structures that help with memorization. It's as if these stories were crafted by many voices over many years, and only later written down in the form we know today. And that brings us to the Homeric question. Was Homer a real person, or just a name invented to tie together epic poems created collectively over generations? Today, many scholars believe Homer wasn't a historical figure, but more of a literary symbol, a kind of brand name invented by ancient Greek culture to give credit for these massive epics. Think of it this way: the Greeks needed an author they could point to, a genius who embodied the wisdom, imagination, and grandeur of their people. So they gave the world Homer. Was there ever a single poet by that name? Maybe. But the Homer we picture, the blind man who saw more than anyone else, is most likely a mythical figure, shaped to personify the epic soul of ancient Greece. There are no ancient inscriptions about him, no statues made during his lifetime, no tomb, no manuscripts written in his own hand. Everything we know about Homer comes from the works attributed to him. And those works? They're very real. The Iliad and the Odyssey have lasted millennia. They've been copied, studied, translated, reimagined. They've inspired emperors, poets, playwrights, soldiers, revolutionaries. They've shaped how we think about honor, destiny, love, and tragedy. And to this day, they're studied in the most prestigious universities around the world. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Which legendary figure do you wish had actually existed? And if you want a part 2, more mysterious names from history who might never have been real, just say the word. I'll see you in the next video. Until then.